How are the archaeological findings of pagan idols and gods mentioned in the Bible important for biblical trustworthiness?
Okay. So when we find artifacts, let's say a common one for Israel is finding Baal statuettes. Or my professor would, of course, correct me and be like, it's Baal. So I will try and use that pronunciation so he doesn't, correct me later. He's very gracious. Both of my professors are, but still, it's like, I gotta make him proud. So when we find little statuettes of Baal and we see that it's mentioned, especially like in First and Second Kings, it does lend credibility to the biblical text. Because if they mention that, okay, these people groups are worshiping this God and it's nowhere to be found, that could present a problem. But again, we haven't found everything yet. And if you read the biblical text, oftentimes idols could be made of wood. Wood is not very well preserved in that climate over thousands of years. So if the idol's made of wood, it's going to be gone. It's going to be barely detectable, maybe in soil samples, maybe. And that depends on the level of erosion and water flow through a site. So again, it's part of that. Okay, so what can we expect to find? Having those reasonable expectations. So I think it is like, going back to that Shakespearean play analogy, it's all part of the set design. So when we are finding out different things, maybe about, or, I love reading about Greek and Roman mythology. When we find a statue of Artemis, let's say, that helps us picture more in our minds what Paul's talking about when he's writing about, Luke wrote about Acts, and, there's this whole controversy about Diana of the Ephesians, which it mentions silversmith specifically there. Silver, if the idol's made of silver can be melted down and reused. If that idol's no longer worshipped, or if it gets damaged in some way, it probably got melted down. Metal was so precious in the ancient world that they didn't just toss it out if they could possibly reuse it. So that's why a lot of metal artifacts aren't preserved. Plus, again, preservation, if the soil composition is the wrong mix for whatever that metal is, it can erode to the point where it's hardly anything left. It's unrecognizable at some points. And that presents a challenge, of course, for conservationists. But so finding out even pagan related things, like whether it's a temple or an idol or an inscription, it can help us understand what the Bible's talking about. Like, for instance, you see all the prophets like just talking about all this idol worship. And sometimes they'll say reference like the Queen of Heaven, for instance, which is, I think it's traditionally interpreted to be Asherah, if I remember correctly. Well, we wouldn't know who the Queen of Heaven is, depending on your theology, you might think that's the Virgin Mary. But of course, that's in the Old Testament. So what the heck? What are they talking about? So you can get in some very weird conspiracy theory type ideas if you don't understand what they're actually talking about. So that's where you have to look up, okay, when he uses this phrase, what did it mean in that time? And you have to look at those pagan sources sometimes to be like, oh, okay, that was an epithet of this god or goddess. I was reading just the other day about how there's Psalms that talk about, the terror by night. And some scholars believe that that is actually a reference to certain Babylonian demons that were believed to stalk at night and come into houses and kill children and do horrible things. So, and if you think about before street lights and electricity, the ancient world was literally a very dark place. You'd have your little lamp, your little campfire, and everything beyond that circle of light was incredibly dark, especially if there's no moon. If it's a cloudy night or it's a new moon, it's incredibly dark. So, and I actually have a friend who's doing some research about light in the ancient world. So I'm very excited to see her findings on that. But yes, understanding these other cultures, even if we're not agreeing with them, and even if we're not worshiping the gods that they worship, we still should understand what's going on there, because it can inform the biblical text. It's almost like, so with the prophets, think of it as somebody's on the phone, but you're only hearing half of the conversation. You have to know what the other person's saying to be able to know what those responses are. You only get so much from half of a conversation. And I would say these pagan sources and the pagan archaeology is the other half of the conversation a lot of times.